Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome once again. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom Torah Study live and online. And I'm joined this morning, as every Shabbos morning, every good Shabbos morning, by my two dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University, and Rabbi Marc Gellman, who is newly planted in his new home in Florida. And we wish both of you good Shabbos and good morning and welcome. Nice to have you here.
Shabbos. Nice to see you.
Mazel tov, Marc, on your move. In about 2 weeks, just 2 weeks actually, exactly 2 weeks, we're going to be beginning the high holidays with the arrival of Rosh Hashanah. And as we've said many times, this is going to be a Rosh Hashanah like none other. Instead of gathering up the family, gathering up ourselves and our loved ones, dressing up nice and coming to the shul, seeing friends and family, sitting in the seats that we sit in every year with the people we sit in every year, listening to the rabbi talk and listening to the cantor, the choir present the prayers. Instead of that, this year, we're going to have to do it at home by ourselves. Our own homes are going to become mikdash ma'at. Our own homes are going to become a facsimile of the sanctuary, a facsimile or a model rather of the holy place where we welcome the holiday. Many of us will be tuning into the holiday online. Our synagogues will be presenting Zoom services or some sort of virtual online services. But that's going to be a very interesting experience, of course, because while usually I allow myself to be distracted by the crowd that gathers around me, by the friends I get to see, by the people I watch. You know, there's always a family or two, a row or two away from me on the holidays. And over the years, I've watched their kids grow up. At first, they were small and ran around the synagogue, and then they became teenagers, and then they became young adults, and then they went away to college and came back. And in many cases, if you've been in the same seats in the same synagogue for some time, you've seen those kids marry and bring partners into the world and then bring children and watch families grow, which is a beautiful thing. It's one of the loveliest things about the holidays. But this year, none of that's going to be available to us. So we'll be sitting in our private space, our homes, perhaps with family and friends around, or perhaps just by ourselves. And we're going to open up the amoxer. And this year, as no other year, we're going to have to pay attention to what's written in the amoxer. Or rather, there's nothing to distract us from what's written in the amoxer. And here's the question I'd like to share with my colleagues this morning and discuss this morning. Well, if I look into the amoxer, I discover a whole language, a whole religious language. And it's a religious language that I don't find particularly easy to accept, a religious language that doesn't quite resonate. Here is a religious language which assigns God the role of king. We're going to say over and over again, Malchuyot, Melech al kol haaretz. God is ruler, sovereign, king over all the earth. And the problem there as well, number one, is that we don't have particularly positive associations with kingship. We think of kingship as absolute rule. It's the opposite of the democracy that we cherish. So what does that mean to say that God is king? I can understand why in bygone ages, a king or a benevolent king, a loving king, a fatherly kind of king was an image that the liturgy would fasten to. But what do I do with that in this day and age? And beyond that, it's a masculine image. It's a power image. A king can be arbitrary. A king can be cruel. A king can destroy as well as create. So what do I do with that image? And beyond kingship, there's the whole language of judgment. After all, the mythos of the holiday is that God opens a great book in heaven and, like this divine auditor, sees my name on one particular line, all of the events and deeds of mine, choices of my last year, and makes this fateful decision about my fate for the coming year. The judgment theme of the holiday is very powerful, and we'll come to a climax, of course, on Yom Kippur. So I'd like to ask Rabbi Hirsch, Rabbi Gellman, to help us understand, how do we deal with this language? How do we understand it? How can we interpret it? How can we make use of it? What does it suggest to us? And if it's difficult for you too, what would you suggest that we might do with this language so that we can enjoy this holiday and come out of it with a deeper sense of who we are and what this new year calls upon us to do? Why don't we begin with a personal question? How do you pray the holidays? And Marc, you've been doing this for many, many years, longer than Sherre and I. tell me how you dealt with this language in the holiday liturgy.
Well, I have a sort of a strange approach to these prayers. I meditate before Yontif and during the service as well on the prayers that are the most difficult for me. The easy prayers, I don't really take much time with because they're just easy and I love them. And the Mariv Aravim and the cycle of light and darkness and the beauty of nature, all of that is easy for me. The hard prayers are the Unasana Tokef, which, Sherre, I just want to say you were so brilliant last week and so emotionally vulnerable about your mother and her difficulties with that prayer, which we all have, but it was so courageous what you said. And then the Avinu Malkeinu prayer. So since we talked about the Unasana Tokef, I'll say what some of my meditations are about Avinu Malkeinu. The first is that I try to take the patriarchal element of king, the kingship, and I try and say, maybe that's the truth. That's how I meditate. What if you're wrong, Gellman? What if the things that bother you are really not true in the end? So what if it's possible that God has a male and a female part? Not a person, not a human being, of course, but a masculine and a feminine aspect. What if that's true? And what if the masculine aspect of God is the aspect of God as the judger of our life? And that goes back to a beautiful interpretation you've offered, Eddie, about how actions have consequences. And the theologies that many of the people we pray with and we pray for are very, very, they're, I would say, without trying to be too judgmental, I know this sounds very judgmental, but they're childish theologies. They're theologies in which we speak to God the way we would speak to a pal. Hey, God, it's me, Chuck. How you doing? I'm okay. You know, are we good for the coming year? We okay? I'm good with you. You good with me? That kind of excessive familiarity with the creator of the freaking universe, to me, is out of place and lacks the element of awe, which we don't associate with women. We associate nurture and love with women, and with men, a very different aspect. And the second element is that Avinu Malkeinu, the Avinu, is the merciful part of the prayer. That's the parent. God is the loving parent. Malkeinu is God as the stern and distant judge. So I like both. Upon meditation, I'm prepared to affirm that God presents us with two elements, two aspects. God as a merciful parent and God as a judgmental king. And both of them are true about our relationship with God. And to say that God is just some pal up in the sky or excessively familiar doesn't do justice to the underlying reason we have trouble with the amoxer and with Yontif. And that is, we are being judged for our life. And many of us will not live to see the next Yontif. That is the truth. And that puts us into tremendous fear. And that's why we dress in on Yom Kippur, in the clothing we will be buried in a kittel. So that's my general approach. I try to take the prayers I like the least and are most difficult and find some truth in them.
Good, thank you. Sherre, tell me how you pray these holidays and how you deal with the language of the amoxer.
So I have an intellectual response, and then I have a human, or I would call heart response. The intellectual response is something I learned a long time ago, is that there's only 500 words used in the Bible, in the first 5 books of the Torah, over and over again. 88 of those words are different names for God. So if there can be almost 1/5 of the entire 5 books of the Torah are dedicated to renaming God. So clearly no one had ownership of what that name was. And for my purposes, I said in my very first book, call God George, call God whatever you want. And I appreciate, Marc, the sentiment that like it's too personal, but to me, it's just a set of letters that are coming together. So on the intellectual side, this is just a name that a group of people, when constructing this book, used to categorize a metaphor that they didn't understand, right? So the king was the person with the most power in their society, thus they called it a king, right? And today we wouldn't use that language. So that's my intellectual answer. My heart answer is that when I look at the amoxer, the language feels very antiquated. And when I was in rabbinical schools, so many of my female colleagues were like, I can't even look at this. It's sexist. And it would obstruct them from praying. When I look at the amoxer, I look at it as if someone is talking to you and you're not agreeing with everything they said, and you're not sure about all the things, and you're not sure of your rightness, you're not sure of their wrongness, but beneath it is a message that is essential to your being. And so sometimes when I listen to people, I'm like, and this is not to either of you, when I'm listening to the two of you, I'm all in. But when I'm listening, sometimes I'm like, listen for the message. Don't get caught up in how it's being conveyed or the words or the tone. Listen to what's really being said. And my higher self, my heart self can do that. And I have an easier time doing that during the high holidays because I'm not distracted. What's hard for me to do is in everyday life because I'm triggered, because I'm angry, whatever's going on. But on the high holidays, I kind of sit back, I look at the book, and I say, don't get trapped in the tone, in the words. Look for the essence of the message. And the message is, I am but dust and ashes. This life is precious. This is a fragile moment, and I have to take note. I have to be present. And I stay focused on all those messages. And one of the ways I do it is I open up the page. I don't follow when the rabbi's giving the pages. Don't tell anyone that. And Rabbi Feinstein, when you're giving the pages, I'm always following, just FYI. But just teasing. But I told people when I was rabbiing in a pulpit, don't stick to the page. Pick a word and let that word animate your being. So like let your finger fall on a word and just let it be. And let that word take you through the messaging as opposed to being obstructed and feeling barriers because of all the other language. So that's my higher self, but I don't always do it. I try to.
It's a wonderful thing. Tell me how you deal. There's one particular word I want to focus on for a moment, which is the word melech, which is one of the key words in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy in particular. We have this very large section of prayer called Malchuyot, and the bracha that we're going to say, which sanctifies the entire holiday, is Melech al Kol Haaretz, Mekadesh HaShabbat, Melech al Kol Haaretz, Mekadesh Yisrael. What do you do with Melech? What does God's kingship mean today in a modern context, in a context of human beings who define themselves as sovereign individuals, as thinking individuals, as grasping individuals, or people who grasp the world, understanding it? What do you do with Melech? Either one. Sherre, you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead, Marc. No, go ahead, Marc.
Okay. Well, for me, philosophically, it comes to be a rejection of Locke, Bentham, and Hume, a rejection of Rousseau, a rejection of all of the state of nature and the individualistic British empiricists who believe that we create social entities by making social contracts that keep us out of the state of nature. And we have rights which we assert against other isolated individuals who also have rights. That's entirely different philosophically from the biblical and later rabbinic understanding of our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. In Judaism, there is no doctrine of individual rights. No one has any rights in Judaism. We have duties. And there's a difference between having rights and duties. You can assert a right. You can develop a right against the hostile incursions of others, as Marc said. But rights produce a world in which, again, Karl Marx wrote, we see in our neighbor the source of our limitations rather than the source of our fulfillment. In Judaism, we see in our neighbor a character, a person, a being who's made in the image of God. And we have duties to protect them, to help them if they fall, to return their cattle, to return their lost objects, to be kind to them and to treat them with the remembrance that we were slaves in Egypt. So for me, the whole way that people get alienated from the amoxer is by reading too much British empiricist thinking and too much rights theory. And they have to really rip apart that entire foundation of American democracy and replace it with a very Judaic, very countercultural, I would say, idea that we have a web of duties that link us to each other, and that those duties produce a society that is healthy and vigorous and just. And that is our teaching. Not that we have rights, but that we are joined by a very different way of imagining our connections.
Sherre, what do you do with Melech?
So I take a different stance, but that was beautiful, Marc, which is that the biblical God that we see in the first 5 books of the Torah is broken, fallible, definitely needs therapy, dysfunctional, gets angry. And then later on, when the amoxer is put together with all this liturgy, they idealize and create this aspirational God. But that's not the God we see in the Bible. And so I use it again as a metaphor for the aspiration of who we want to become. So Melech becomes not, they wanted God to become kingly, royal, fair, and just, but that's not who God was. God was broken and all these things. I look at that, especially Melchiot, which has given me so many problems over the year, that section. I love Shofar Road, I love Zikra Note, and Melchiot starts the group, and I'm always like, really, this is what we need? But what I think more about is, what is the aspirational God that I need in this moment? Like, do I need the God that can comfort me? Because for them, they needed a God that felt bigger and a ruler and that would serve them. But really, again, it's the meaning. What's the God I need in my life right now? And in full candor, you know, different parts of my life and different Rosh Hashanahs, I've needed different types of a relationship with God, right? Some years I needed like a foe to challenge me, and other years I needed someone to comfort me. And so I look at that as, what is the aspirational God that I need in this moment? Not the Melech, but who's that imagined kind of God that I need?
What worked for you, Eddie? This is not fair. You get
I'm coming.
And you give us the hardest questions you could possibly ask somebody, and then you say good Shabbos, see you next week.
Isn't that wonderful? See what I've arranged here?
Power.
This is why we're not senior rabbis, Marc, anymore.
This is what you got to do.
I'm not taking it anymore.
Okay, so first of all, I want to step back a page and actually, the first thing to me that's interesting is that we have a liturgy altogether. I mean, it's interesting to me that we have a liturgy. I mean, if you think about this for a moment, what the prayer service is asking us to do, especially on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, is to really look deeply within to evaluate the life we've been living, the year we've just spent, to gather in the wonder of what it means to be alive, to recognize the mystery of a very uncertain future, and to feel all of those feelings at the same time. And the fact that there's a liturgy, there's a, that I as a rabbi say, please turn to this page and rise and join with the cantor, and then turn to this page, and then turn to this page, and then, there's a sort of a program to this thing. There's a wonderful statement in the Mishnah, which is the first code of Jewish law. It was assembled in the end of the second century, year 200. And you have this wonderful conversation there about the Amidah prayer, which occurs in every one of our services. And the question is, how many of the brachot do you have to say? So Rabbi Gamliel, who's the nasi of the community, the leader of the community, he says you have to say 18 of them. That's the minimum daily adult requirement for prayer, 18 blessings. And Rabbi Yoshua, who has has a sensitivity for working people, because he's a working man, says, no, you can say an abbreviated version if you're in a hurry. Working people have to get to work, and they don't have a chance to daven all morning the way that rich guys like Rabbi Gamliel could. And Rabbi Akiva, who's their student, is trying to make peace, and he says, it depends on how quickly you read Hebrew. And then comes Rabbi Eliezer, who is no lightweight, he's a powerful, powerful rabbi. He's the Av Beis Din. He's the second in command of the community. And he says, keva eno tachnunin. If you set this as a system and you tell people, this is what you have to pray at this moment, in this way, on this page, if that's what you think prayer is, you're not praying. Praying has to come from someplace much deeper inside. So first of all, the whole question that there's a liturgy, to me, is sort of a wonder. Right? That's the first piece. So what do you do with this liturgy? So even before I get to the question of how I understand Melech or Avinu Malkeinu, how do you understand liturgy? So for me, the image that has always been in front of me is that it's an art museum. And that what we're being asked to do is to walk through an art gallery. Because this isn't authoritative text in the sense that, say, Bible might be, where here's what you have to believe. These are individual perceptions of the world created by the most sensitive, talented souls who ever lived among our people. And each one is a portrait of the world. And in the same way that you go to an art gallery and you stand in front of a portrait or a picture, a landscape or a still life, and you get to see the world through the eyes of one great sensitive soul. We get to see the eyes through the greatest sensitive souls of the Jewish people. We never had plastic arts. We know Marc has talked about this many times. They didn't have plastic arts because they took the second commandment literally and said, don't make any images. And because we were a portable people, we had to be ready to run, right? So we could never have a Michelangelo who's carving gigantic statues, or we couldn't even have a Rembrandt. It was only into modernity that you get Jewish painters. So what we did is take all of our aesthetic impulses and pour them into poetry. And that's what you have in the prayer book. The prayer book is the Louvre. It's the greatest hits of the Jewish people. It's a collection of the greatest aesthetic images. And because we're religious people, they're all religious images. Now, I go to the Louvre and I see a magnificent Madonna and Child. It's not my religious language, but I can appreciate what the symbols are trying to convey to me, what they're trying to hold, what they're trying to share with me. I can see paintings which are, muted and dark. I can see paintings which are bright and explosive, impressionists, expressionists, abstracts, and I find the same thing in the prayer book. And I urge people who are praying to look at the prayer book like that. Walk through the gallery and ask yourself, what is this particular soul trying to say to me? What is this painting trying to say to me? Now, it's true that the idiom, there's the images that are going to be used in the amoxer, are medieval and ancient. And in that world, kingship meant something. It meant power. It meant authority. And in some ways, it also meant paternalistic love, a kind of kindness, protection. And that's what you find among God as king in the amoxer. For us, I think it has one profound image, one profound implication. And that implication is, I'm not Melech HaOlam. That the great religious problem isn't about discovering God. The great religious problem is, how do you displace the ego from the center of the universe? Right? Most of us are born, as Sigmund Freud taught us, as king baby. We are born to think that we're the center of the universe, because when we were infants, we cried and the whole world came to pick us up and feed us and diaper us. And you know, some people outgrow that. But all of us maintain some element of that where we think we're the center of the universe. And the first lesson of any of our holidays, the first lesson particularly of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, is you're not the center of the universe. Because until you displace the ego from the center of the universe, you're never going to be able, as Marc says, to recognize your responsibilities to others. You're never going to be able to include another, right? You're never going to be able to love another. I remember I had a wonderful conversation with a young man who was getting married, you know, who told me that the girl he was marrying checked all of his boxes. And I said, you're not ready to get married. You think this is about you? It's not about you. You're not ready to get married until you tell me that you check all of her boxes, that your job in life is to see that she continues to grow, what you can give and serve her. But that's a displacement of ego, which is very hard to do for many people. So here you get this powerful language in the Aleinu l'shabeach, where you throw yourself down on the ground, you physically adopt a posture of humility in order to try to displace the self from the center of the universe and open up a space that's more or less the size of God in the center of the universe, and allow somebody else to have a place, something else to have a place in the center of the universe. And that, to me, is how I begin to see what the amoxer is trying to do for us on this holiday.
You know, let me tell you a story about the Avinu Malkeinu, because there's a piece we haven't included that I think we need to. And that is the amoxer as a list of songs. I mean, part of what ties us together is that we know the melodies. And part of what brings smiles to people's faces is singing the Avinu Malkeinu. If you ask a lot of people, I know in my shul, you ask them, do you believe what you just prayed? That God's a king and God's a father for women? Can you pray to a God who's masculine in that way? And the answer is no, they can't do that. But if you ask them, what's your favorite Yontif song? They say, I love Avinu Malkeinu. I love Avinu Malkeinu. And in fact, I was talking to some of the people once who were responsible for the New Reformed Prayer Book. And they were doing a gender-neutral prayer book, as our movement was wont to do. And I was arguing against it because I think there were ways to preserve the tradition. And because Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad is what we know as, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The Avinu Malkeinu, so I said, you had Avinu Malkeinu. There's a perfect non-gender translation of it. Why didn't you include it in the New Reformed Prayer Book, which is our parent, our sovereign, right? Our parent, our sovereign is the perfect gender-neutral way to clean up the Avinu Malkeinu prayer and make it theologically acceptable. They couldn't do it. They didn't have the guts to do it because they said, what, are you kidding, Marc? What, are you kidding? People love Avinu Malkeinu. They love singing Avinu Malkeinu. So what did they do? They simply put in the English translation, Avinu Malkeinu, we have sinned before thee. So they put in a little chunk of Hebrew saying, look, we're not going to translate this because we don't have the courage to put in what we know we want to put in, which is our parent, our sovereign. We're going to put in Avinu Malkeinu and then continue with the English. So that's my point, that with all this fancy theology, we forget that a lot of the love that people have for Yontif is the familiar melodies. And those melodies carry a non-verbal theology.
That's true. No, that's very true. The melodies really have power. Look, the only reason Kol Nidre was kept in the tradition was because the melody, because the rabbis couldn't stand the prayer. But if you've ever looked, by the way, Marcia Falk, for example, is one of the poets that have created beautiful alternative versions. And here, I would love to hear an alternative version. So instead of Avinu is Imenu, because motherhood has a whole different set of implications and associations and resonances than father. And instead of Malkenu, because the other thing that feminism taught us is that it doesn't have to be vertical hierarchy. So instead of Malkenu, what she would use is something like Be'erenu, which is like the well of life. To think about a source of life, not a melech above us, but a source of life within us or around us, the embrace of love around us. And I think that would be a magnificent alternative to this prayer. I think that's a much nicer alternative to the prayer. Sherre, do you daven in the masculine or the feminine when you daven? Can we ask you that?
It's so funny because I don't even think about it as masculine or feminine. I feel like God has no gender. And so to me, I think I said this before, like the language is just a springboard. It doesn't trap me. And if I get caught up in the language, then it means that I'm just not really in the mood to daven, right? Like when I want to pray and I'm all focused on the words and everything has to be exactly perfect, I'm trying to do something, I call it performance rabbi. I'm trying to like perform the rabbi role. When I'm actually davening and praying, I'm like just in it. And like the words are just these little framings that people gave for metaphors that are helpful tools to let me get in it. But I do want to say one thing, Eddie, is when I was at Sinai, I worked with Gabbaim to train them in the amoxer. So for all summer prior to the holidays, we would meet once a week and we would study the language of the liturgy. And I had them take a highlighter and a pen and write all over it with stickies and all kinds of things. And at first they were like, Rabbi, we can't write in the prayer book. And I was like, why not? And I had them do cards and rewritings of prayers and all kinds of things. So when they came to the high holidays, they had this amoxer that was filled with stickies and notes and highlighted and rewritten prayers. And it was like this interactive book that they could daven with. And so often I used to come to the high holidays, I'd open the book and I would close it as fast as I opened it and I would just listen to music. But I could see them really reading it because it was all these prayers that were written beforehand and prepped all through Elul and all through the month. And what I encourage people to do is to interact with your book. Great books, you highlight the quotes. You put a sticky in the part where you want to remember it. You write a note, you write a message, you send it like a thing. All of that happens in a great book. Why not with your prayer book? And so, you may not write on the holidays, but all the time before now of Elul, start to like get into it with the book. Put a separate prayer in, put another word in, cross it out and say, I don't like this word, right? Interact with the book. And that way, when you go to daven on that day, you're seeing a language of interaction and a relationship between you and the prayers that existed long before and will continue long after. And I just want to say we did this for about 8 years. And people had these amoxers that were packed to the gills with notes and highlighted and stickies and Post-its. I love Post-its. And they would say to me, like, I can't believe who I was 5 years ago. I can't believe I would have written that then. Or, oh my God, that was so insightful. I didn't know I had that in me, especially the kids who did it when they were like 13 to 18 or 18 to 25. It was really quite beautiful. So I encourage people to use that tool.
I think that's a beautiful thing. I just want to put one little plea. We're lending out amoxers to the congregation. So starting next week, if you're a member of VBS, you can pick up a couple of amoxers to use at home. Don't write in those.
I was going to say,
go online. You can use stickies, but take them off when you're done. Right?
Yeah,
buy yourself a amoxer. Right.
I was going to say, you know what? It's the best investment as you build your Jewish library. Buy a amoxer. Don't write in the VBS moxery. Like, just don't.
It's interesting because we do that. I have one for myself that I use on the pulpit, and it has 25 years of notes in it. And it's a beautiful thing to do because you keep a record of your thinking. And I scribble, as I'm preparing Yontif, I scribble my notes into the margins, which is an old Jewish thing to do.
It's really funny that you said it because the reason I got that idea is I looked at my amoxer and it was like trashed. I mean, it had notes and this and that. And I looked at all their amoxers when we sat down the first day and they were like pristine. They were like
Yeah.
perfect little with the bound, and you open them up and they cracked, and mine was like, you know, and that's
Right.
where I said, something's wrong here. If I'm the rabbi and I'm trying to engage them, why does my book look so different than theirs?
Right.
And that's how it started.
It's the Rosh Hashanah equivalent of the Haggadah that has all the wine stains and all the matzah crumbs on every page.
I
I
never
just
thought
want
of
to,
that. It's beautiful.
but I want to go back, and I don't want to push you on this because we don't have time now today to really take this up. But I want to ask this question, okay? And I, with due respect and love, because you represent the first generation of women rabbis to really lead the community, which is just such a gift. I mean, it's a blessing to us all. But one of the things that feminist theology has taught us to be aware of, when I open the amoxer and I read Avinu Malkeinu, those are gendered patriarchal metaphors that I can relate to because I am an Avinu, I'm an Av, I'm a father, I have a father, I'm a father. They're gender specific to me, but they're not gender specific to you. And while you say I just push them off, I don't think of God as gendered. First of all, you ever had this exercise where I had people translate prayers from masculine to feminine? We recited the whole Shabbos Kiddush that way. And people said, ooh, it feels weird. Well, because it's unusual. But then some of the women in the room said, no, I kind of like this. I like having gendered metaphors that meet my gender instead of yours. Because feminism has taught us what it means to have genders that don't recognize your being in the world. You have two beautiful, gifted daughters, you know, and I have a beautiful, gifted daughter and now two beautiful, gifted daughters-in-law. I'd like them to hear the words in the other mode. I'd like them to hear, and the other metaphors that capture a female feminist experience of the world and God. And I wonder how that would change our high holiday liturgy. Instead of this judging God who is masculine, whether it would be a welling God, a motherly, a Shekhinah kind of thing. I wonder how that would change the whole tenor of the holiday. And I wonder if that's one of the projects of the next generation. Sherre, do you think that's a project of the next generation?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, I want to say, you know, I was in the first generation, but your wife was the first or second of all the ordained first conservative women rabbis. So I don't consider myself, I feel like I just stand on her, you know, laurels, because there were a group of women that were truly pioneers. I was like that next wave.
Amy Eilberg was ordained. Nina was the first woman accepted to the JTS rabbinical school because we were there. Amy was in Israel at the time, but we had a kid and we wanted to stay with the kid. So because my wife wanted to be mom, Amy got ordained ahead of her, and Nina was number 2. So she was accepted first, but ordained second. But these were the pioneers, right?
Well, and those were
I was ordained with Sally.
Right.
Suzanne. It's interesting because I remember as a kid hearing about them being ordained and thinking, I could do that. You know, like some people are like, they see like an actor and they're like, I want to act. I had never felt that, but I heard them and I saw that it was in the New York Times, I believe, or it was like in the Newsweek or something. Yes.
I was front page New York Times because I was standing behind Sally.
I remember, that was the moment that I had, you know, where people are like, I could do that. That was the first moment I had, like, I could do that, and thought, and so
which is precisely the reason that Nina, my wife, fought like hell and swallowed an awful lot of abuse in order to become ordained a conservative rabbi, because she knew that there were classes of little girls who she was teaching who would never have thought of themselves in that role unless the person who stood in front of them looked a lot like them and said, this is your Torah too. That's why they did it.
You have to see, the reason I bring that up to answer your question is you have to see yourself in the tradition, and what women haven't been at all seeing themselves. And there's a huge group of women scholars now working on the female interpretation of the Talmud, right? Which is the conversations around the Mishnah. And it's the oral tradition. And what's so powerful about it is every time you teach another woman, you open this huge doorway for women to see themselves. And I'm so grateful. I've had 4 women become rabbis that I bought mitzvah and were my students. And I truly believe it's not because I was such a great rabbi. That's not it. It's actually they saw themselves. and the way I saw your wife and the way I saw Sally present. And I think when we do present options like a female version of the Torah, of the Talmud, when we do change the language, which I use it interchangeably when I'm teaching, I don't stick to the text. I throw it out there in many different ways. I'll say rock, I'll say God, I'll say George, I'll throw it out. Because when we do see ourselves, it opens up all these different possibilities. And I think everybody feels that, whatever marginalized group they're from. When you see yourself, you see possibility.
Let me tell you, I'll close with, from my side, this wonderful story. I speak to when I was teaching and when I was the senior rabbi at the shul, every week there was an Ask the Rabbi for the little kids with me. I insisted on it. And my assistant rabbi, now the senior rabbi of Temple Beth Torah, Susie Moskowitz, woman, and our cantor is a woman, Serene Applebaum, and Rachel Wiesenberg is our associate rabbi and director of the school. And so I'm teaching the kids, and one little girl stands up and says, Rabbi Gellman, is it okay for a man to become a rabbi? And when I heard that, I knew we had won. I knew we had won. Because there it was, in her little life, all the religious leaders in her shul were women, except for me. And so she just took it as a total natural thing that a woman could be a rabbi. And she was wondering, is it okay for a man to be a rabbi?
Yeah.
It was just a wonderful little thing.
So go ahead. I want to finish with something controversial now. So I have told my congregation every year, because our services are interminably long. This year they won't be because they're online, but generally they're pretty long. So I've said to people, look, if you bring a book. If you're not going to, if you meditate, then you can have a really good meditation in my shul. If you nap, you can have a really good shlof. But otherwise, bring a book that inspires you to think about you in the world, your life, your past, your future, your destiny. And I've recommended over the years a list of books. So this year we're going to have, relatively shorter services online, and we're going to have a lot of time. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah's day, the 2 days, Yom Kippur afternoon. What book should someone be reading? What book are you going to be reading? What book would you recommend to people to be reading this year to help them with a Yontif kind of meditation? Marc, you want to start?
Oh yeah, that's easy. It's my favorite book. And I read it actually in my preparation for Yontif every year. It's Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. And for me, it's the best book because it's about the human struggle against nature, as it turns out, the fish. But it isn't like Moby Dick. It's a totally different theme than Moby Dick, which is also a struggle against an animal. But for me, The Old Man and the Sea was the greatest description of trying something gigantic and failing. But it isn't a failure because of the trying. It reminded me of T.S. Eliot's quote, "The trying is all that matters. Everything else is just not our business." And that's the mantra that I use before I go into the bima to begin the service. The trying is all that matters. Everything else is not your business.
I love, Eddie, that you suggested a book, because when I was a kid on Shabbos, I used to bring a book and put it in my prayer book every week. And my father encouraged it because I would sit next to him and I would read my book. And this father ratted me out to the rabbi. And I saw them talking up at the bima, and I could see him looking at me. And the rabbi came down and made a very big deal. And I'll never forget this. He came down and in a very audible voice, he's like, "Sherre, what are you reading?" And I looked at him like, oh my God, I've been found out. He goes, "I need to know, so I might want to borrow it next week." And I remember just like, he wanted to show us, like, just be present. And if that means having a book there. And so I can tell you what my favorite book is to read at the high holidays, but many of you will be like, I don't even get it, because it's such a thick book, which is Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith. It has fundamentally changed my life. That being said, it's a thick read. It's not like a lovely read on Rosh Hashanah. What I tell people is pick one book that has a Jewish value proposition that you're interested in, whether it's a Telushkin book, whether it's Simple Words by Dean Steinsaltz, whether it's a novel, whether it's The Red Tent. Like, pick one book, put it in right next to your amoxer, have no shame about it. As my rabbi taught me, have no shame about learning, ever, no matter what it is you're learning. And hold that book and read it. So whatever it is, when you have all that time at home right now, pick a book. But if you do want a book, The Lonely Man of Faith is brutal to get through. But I have to tell you, every time I read it, it changes me.
If you wanna follow The Lonely Man of Faith, which is a wonderful, amazing thing, but it's very hard to read.
Very.
The New York Times columnist David Brooks has now written but he's become America's preacher, by the way. He stopped writing about politics and he writes about character. And he's written 2 books about character. The first one was about character, and the second was called, I think, called The Second Mountain.
The Two Mountains, right?
2 Mountains, about community. He bases the first book on Soloveitchik. So he has a really good, the first chapter is a really good explanation of what Soloveitchik is trying to accomplish in that essay, and makes it very accessible. So David Brooks's books.
And this week, actually, David Brooks was in conversation with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks on Rabbi Jonathan's new book on morality. And actually, it's some of the insights that Rabbi Brooks made in relation to Judaism that are fascinating. And you can download it. It's on your computer now.
Yeah, and Rabbi Sax's books are also a set of books that I recommend to people widely. This book on morality is his take on our current situation in society. And his basic thesis is that we have forgotten that we are a we and have become obsessed with the I. It goes back to that notion of the ego being the center of the universe. And because of that, that's corrupted politics, it's corrupted the economy, it's corrupted our intellectual life, and basically it's destroying the world, and we have to reclaim a sense of collective purpose in the world. You can read the book, but I'm going to warn you that your rabbi sermons, too many of the rabbi sermons you might hear this year sound a little bit like that book, because it's a very powerful thesis. And
there was also, Brooks said something interesting this week that I would just add, is that we've
Please.
lost a language of morality. Like, we've lost the words, and it very much relates to what we're talking about today, is to what degree do we use the words, and to what degree do we set aside the words, and to what degree do we have to find new words around, especially morality.
So Rabbi Saxbooks' Morality, his other books are very wonderful as well. I've always recommended to people Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. It was retitled called The Search for Meaning. Frankl, of course, very famous story, was a Viennese psychiatrist who was taken to Auschwitz. And he decided that the only way to survive Auschwitz was to become the clinician he was, and sort of use Auschwitz as a laboratory to study how men and women under the worst of circumstances survive and find purpose. And basically his notion is, if you can find a purpose, you can find ways to survive. If you can find a why, you can always find a how, he says. And that's one of the great sort of statements of the power of the human soul to overcome. A really remarkable and beautiful book. I would recommend this year, I found a new author that I'm interested in. There's a Catholic writer named Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, and his book, Falling Upward. It's a book about the second half of life. And Rohr is interested in something which I've become very interested in, both for personal reasons and professional reasons, which is what do we do with the second half of life? In the first half of life, we make a living, we build a family, we make a name for ourselves, we accomplish all the things, but somehow in midlife, then you take a shift, he says, and you have to look at life in very different ways. And what's the second half of life? How do you understand the second half of life, its tasks and its purposes, and how do you find meaning in the second half of life? How do you grow old with a sense of satisfaction and purpose? And I found that book to be very, very challenging and very interesting. I'd also, of course, always recommend anything written by Abraham Joshua Heschel. Just read him very slowly, because you have to absorb the words and the metaphors and his insistence. And given all the things going on around us, that his essays in Insecurity of Freedom and in Moral Audacity are really remarkable. So as a commentary. Yep.
Eddie, that one of the things that I love doing, even with my adult teenagers, even though they resist, is we read it out loud. Like, before we go to bed, we read like 2 sentences and we just talk about it. And I think during the high holidays, don't feel like you have to read a book and get through it and make it a very private experience. Reading can be a very public experience when you read out loud. And I don't know a single person who doesn't love story time, regardless of their age, right? Story time is just like getting your hair brushed by someone else. It's just this very powerful moment. And so I tell people, don't forget just to read out loud to one another. Read 2 sentences and discuss it at the holiday dinner table.
Right. And if you want to read a story that will leave you with lots to think about, find a copy. You can do it online of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. It's called The Master of Prayer. And it's a story of a world that falls apart and how they bring it back together. So I want to thank my dear colleagues and friends. Rabbi Gellman, Mazel Tov on your new home. Titchadesh, Titchadshu. May this new home bring wonderful opportunities and lots of peace and time to think and grow. Rabbi Hirsch, I hope that your home is a little bit quieter. Your son is in Israel. I hope that he's studying and having a wonderful time, and the rest of the kids are back in school now. And to all of our friends, thank you for joining us this morning. Following our Torah study, of course, VBS will be presenting Shabbos morning services. I'll be davening this morning with Cantor Barron. This evening at 8 o'clock, Nina and I get to produce and present Havdalah. It's at 8 o'clock tonight because the time is becoming a little bit shorter. All week, of course, Minyan tomorrow morning at 8:30 in the morning, all week at 7:30 in the morning, every evening at 6 o'clock. All week we are presenting learning and preparation for the holiday. Wednesday night is Yontif University. Wednesday afternoon I have my Lunch and Learn. Rabbi Farkas's Heroes of Chesed and Rabbi Hoffman's Dynamics of the Amoxer all this week. You're welcome to join us. We'd love to have you. If you're not a part of a synagogue, this is a really good time to join. Synagogues are offering lots of wonderful opportunities to celebrate the holidays, and they desperately need your love and support right now. So please go find a shul near you and sign up, send them a few dollars so that they can keep the lights on and share with you the high holiday prayers. I want to wish everyone a very, very pleasant and wonderful, wonderful Shabbos and a terrific week. Sherre reminds us that AJU, the Biachad series at American Jewish University, also offers wonderful, wonderful Jewish learning. And if you need a book to pass some time with some kids that will make them laugh and cry and say, oh, wow, Rabbi Gellman's book, Does God Have a Big Toe?, is the best book to sit with kids. They will giggle their way through it and go, really? And you'll say, yes, I know the author. He really means it. So please enjoy that book too. Have a wonderful week. Take good care.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat